From ghostly apparitions seen in forgotten graveyards to eerie sounds echoing through abandoned houses, these stories remind us that even in death, some spirits are not at rest. So, dim the lights, hold your breath, and join us as we step beyond the veil into the world of the supernatural. In the rolling hills of the English countryside, surrounded by overgrown hedges and tall whispering trees, stood Wicklow House. Now, decades ago, it was a grand home brimming with life, but now it sat silent and sombre, its empty windows like hollow eyes staring out at the world. Villagers rarely came near Wicklow, not only because of its decaying structure, but because of the stories, whispered tales of a little girl, forever 8, wandering its dusty rooms. One evening, a young couple, Grace and Thomas, moved into Wicklow House. They were drawn by its history and the beauty of the surrounding fields. The property was priced astonishingly low, almost as if it begged for a new life. Grace especially felt enchanted by the house's mystery. She even liked the old nursery room she discovered on the upper floor, with a small rocking horse in the corner and wallpaper faintly decorated with animals. It was as though it hadn't been touched since the early 1900s. The first few days had passed uneventfully. Grace cleaned and restored rooms as Thomas worked on repairs, bringing a sense of cheer back into Wicklow. But in the nursery something felt different. Sometimes she'd catch a glimpse of movements in the corner of her eye, a fleeting shadow, or a faint outline as if someone had passed. She told herself it was just dust, or her imagination running wild. But strange things started happening. Grace began finding little objects, a weathered doll, a small shoe, and they was appearing on the nursery floor, though she hadn't put them there. She was certain Thomas wouldn't have, and when she asked, he assured her he'd never even stepped foot in the nursery. The days passed, and Grace felt a growing chill each time she entered the room, as though the air grew colder when she crossed its threshold. One night as Grace lay in bed, a sound stirred her from her sleep, a faint giggle, like a gentle laughter of a child. She glanced at Thomas, who was fast asleep. Curious and unnerved, she followed the sound, clutching her robe as she wandered into the dark hallway. The sound led her to the nursery. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by the soft moonlight filtering through the dusty window. There in the middle of the room, the rocking horse was moving, creaking slowly as it rocked back and forth, back and forth. Frozen in place, Grace watched wide-eyed, and then she saw a small girl, no more than 8, with pale skin and dark curly hair. She wore an old-fashioned nightgown, torn and faded, her small bare feet ghostly against the floorboards. The girl was looking at Grace, her eyes dark and sorrowful, yet curious. Grace blinked, and the girl vanished, leaving only the faintest chill in the air. The next morning, Grace decided to investigate the house's history. She visited the village library and dug through the records, where she learned of the Fitzroy family, who had once lived in Wicklow House. Mr. and Mrs. Fitzroy had been known in the village as a kind of couple who cherished their daughter Lillian. But tragedy struck one bitter winter night. Lillian had slipped and fallen down the grand staircase, succumbing to her injuries before help could arrive. Heartbroken, the Fitzroys left the house shortly after, and it remained empty for years. The story haunted Grace that night. She lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her mind replayed the sight of the girl in the nursery. She wanted to help somehow. "Lillian," she whispered into the darkness, "if you are there, I'm listening." A soft whisper drifted through the room, carrying her name, Grace. The days that followed were filled with strange occurrences. Lillian's ghost would appear more frequently, especially in the nursery, watching Grace with that same sorrowful gaze. Sometimes Grace would wake to find small, childlike handprints on the walls, or her belongings were rearranged, as if Lillian were trying to get her attention. One rainy evening, Grace decided to try something bold. She placed a doll on the nursery floor, one she had found while cleaning the attic. It was old, but she thought it might comfort the spirit. "This is for you, Lillian," she said softly. "If you're lonely, you're not any more." She waited, and the room grew colder. A faint pressure brushed against her hand, like the soft, timid touch of a small child's fingers. Grace's heart thudded, but she stayed still. In the faint light she could just see Lillian, her spectral form, clutching the doll, cradling it as if it was her long-lost friend. The house seemed to change after that night. The chill that had lingered in the nursery faded, and the whispers grew softer, less sorrowful. Grace even felt a sense of warmth in the house, a faint presence that seemed to be watching over her. She could feel Lillian around, but it was as though the spirits were finally at peace, no longer burdened by the loneliness she enjoyed for so many years. Years later, after Grace and Thomas moved on from Wicklow House, they heard from the next occupants, who found it strangely peaceful, almost welcoming. Grace smiled knowingly, but didn't share the details of her experiences. She knew that somewhere in the corners of Wicklow, little Lillian remained content at last, watching over the home she had loved and lost so long ago. In the quiet hills of rural England, the Ministry of Defence, that's the MOD, operates Foxwood Training Grounds, a sprawling site used for field exercises and drills. Over the years, soldiers have reported strange occurrences, whispers of an unsettling presence lingering amongst the shadows. The story goes that it's haunted by Corporal James Farrow, a World War I soldier whose spirit wanders the fields, bound by an unfulfilled duty. Farrow was once stationed near Foxwood in 1918. He had been part of a small unit training in trench warfare before being deployed. He was known for his steadfast bravery, the kind of soldier who would never leave a man behind. But on a particularly bitter night during a training exercise, something went terribly wrong. He disappeared. He was reported missing after his unit had taken a shortcut through the woods in thick fog. Now, unfortunately, his body was eventually found. It was said his face bore an expression of unspeakable terror, hands frozen as if clutching his rifle. The incident was officially marked as an accident, but locals believed he was lost to something more sinister, a mystery that had never truly been laid to rest. So, a century later, Foxwood remains active, and his story has become part of camp folklore. One rainy autumn night, a new recruit, Private Ian Wheeler, learned just how real these stories could be. After a long day of exercises, Ian had fallen asleep in the barracks, but was startled awake around 2 a.m. by a sound, like a rhythmic pounding, like footsteps marching in sync. Assuming it was just another recruit, he shook off the eerie feeling and decided to ignore it. But as the night wore on, the footsteps grew louder, circling the barracks, never retreating. Unable to ignore it, Ian grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, expecting to find one of his fellow soldiers playing a prank. The grounds were empty, shrouded in a thick mist, and a biting chill hung in the air. As he scanned the field, his flashlight caught the faint outline of a man standing near the edge of the woods, just beyond the training trenches. The figure wore an old-style uniform, a trench coat and a helmet, the unmistakable uniform of a World War I soldier. The man turned, meeting Ian's gaze. Even in the dim light, Ian could see his face, pale and expressionless, with hollow, haunted eyes. Ian called out, his voice trembling, but the figure merely raised his hand in a silent salute before fading into the mist. Heart pounding, Ian stumbled back inside, barely sleeping the rest of the night. The next day he hesitantly told a few comrades about the figure he'd seen. Surprisingly, they didn't laugh. Instead, they exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, Corporal Davis, spoke up. "That's Corporal Farrow," he whispered. "Most of us have seen him at least once. They say he's still looking for his unit." Haunted by the encounter, Ian couldn't shake the feeling that Farrow's spirit was searching for something or someone. The following night he decided to return to the spot where he had seen the figure, hoping to find answers or perhaps lay the spirit to rest. Armed with only his flashlight, Ian ventured to the edge of the woods. The air grew colder as he approached, the silence thick and unnatural. Then he heard it, the faint sound of distant gunfire echoing through the trees, followed by the low murmur of voices and the sharp bark of orders. Heart pounding, he pushed forward until he found himself standing in a shallow trench, one of the old training trenches left from decades past. The sounds grew clearer. Ian realised he was standing in the middle of a spectral reenactment, ghostly replay of the final moments of Farrow's life. Figures moved around him, soldiers in World War I uniforms, running, shouting, clutching rifles as if preparing for an enemy attack. But none of them seemed to notice him, except one. Corporal Farrow emerged from the shadows, his gaze locking onto Ian's with a mix of desperation and determination. "You're here," Farrow whispered, his voice faint but clear. "You must take them back. We can't leave them behind." Ian stood frozen, feeling the weight of Farrow's plea. Somehow he knew that Farrow's spirit was bound to this place, reliving his final moments over and over, because he believed he had failed his men. Ian nodded, his voice steady despite the fear. "I'll take you back." The moment he spoke, the battlefield scene faded, and the cold, empty darkness of the Foxwood training grounds returned. But Farrow remained, watching Ian with gratitude, as though he had finally found someone willing to help him fulfill his duty. Farrow raised his hand once more in a silent salute, and Ian returned it. Slowly the figure began to dissolve, the sorrow and burden lifting from his face as he vanished into the night. The haunting at Foxwood has never quite ended, but after that night the footsteps and the strange sounds grew quieter, less troubled. Ian shared his experience only with a few close friends, yet word spread and soon the tale became part of the MOD folklore. A ghost story with a bittersweet ending. The soldiers who trained at Foxwood learned to honour the spirit of Corporal Farrow, knowing that he remained a part of their legacy, a reminder of the sacrifices and the unbreakable bonds of those who served. As for Ian, he would sometimes visit the trenches, standing on the edge of the woods, silently acknowledging the spectral soldier who had finally found peace.